There's a hidden connection between the wounds of our past and the shadows that follow us into adulthood. Your childhood experiences aren't just memories, they're doorways. Today, we're going to explore 7 deeply rooted childhood traumas that create spiritual vulnerabilities most people never recognize. These aren't just psychological scars, they're spiritual anchor points that can attract forces beyond our understanding. What you're about to learn might explain the unexplainable patterns in your life, those recurring nightmares, the persistent feeling of being watched, or the invisible weight that seems to follow you everywhere. The connection between childhood trauma and spiritual oppression is rarely discussed, but understanding it could be the key to breaking free. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover why certain childhood experiences leave us spiritually exposed, how to recognize these vulnerabilities, and most importantly, how to shield yourself from their influence. Some of what you'll hear might challenge what you think you know about spiritual warfare. Before we begin, remember, knowledge is your first line of defense. While these insights might be unsettling, they're crucial for anyone seeking to understand the deeper impact of their childhood experiences. This isn't just about awareness, it's about reclaiming your spiritual sovereignty. Emotional abandonment cuts deeper than any physical wound. In homes where parents were physically present, but emotionally distant, children develop a unique form of spiritual vulnerability. This first doorway opens when young hearts learn to cope with profound loneliness, even while surrounded by family. A child's soul naturally seeks connection, warmth, and nurturing guidance. When these basic emotional needs go unmet, something extraordinary happens at a spiritual level. That emptiness becomes more than just an emotional void, it transforms into a spiritual vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the spiritual realm. These hollow spaces within a child's spirit become prime territory for darker influences to take root. Parents who consistently prioritize work, social status, or their own emotional needs over their child's create this invisible wound. A mother too depressed to respond to her baby's coos, a father too angry to offer comfort during times of distress. These moments stack up like invisible bricks, building walls between a child and their divine birthright of love and protection. Most striking is how this abandonment rewires a child's spiritual receptors. Rather than developing healthy spiritual connections based on love and trust, these children often form attachments rooted in fear, desperation, and spiritual codependency. Their inner compass becomes miscalibrated, drawing them towards spiritual entities that mirror their early experiences of unreliable love. This spiritual vulnerability manifests in adulthood, through patterns most would never connect to childhood abandonment. Inexplicable attraction to spiritually dangerous situations, difficulty discerning beneficial spiritual influences from harmful ones, and a deep-seated belief that divine love must be earned through suffering, all trace back to these early wounds. In households where emotional abandonment prevailed, children learned to fill their spiritual emptiness with whatever energy was available, regardless of its source. This created pathways through which less benevolent forces could offer false comfort, much like a predator luring prey with the promise of sustenance. Breaking free requires recognizing these patterns and actively reclaiming those abandoned spaces within the soul. Physical violence against a child doesn't just leave visible bruises, it shatters something fundamental in their spiritual armor. When those meant to protect become sources of pain, a catastrophic breach occurs in both body and spirit. This rupture creates more than psychological trauma, it opens spiritual fissures through which malevolent forces can seep. Most devastating is how physical abuse corrupts a child's innate sense of divine protection. Children naturally possess an invisible shield of spiritual innocence, but each blow, each violent touch creates cracks in this protective barrier. These fractures run deeper than flesh and bone, reaching into realms where darkness eagerly awaits such vulnerabilities. Particularly insidious is how physical abuse distorts a child's perception of power and authority. When earthly guardians inflict harm, it becomes nearly impossible for young souls to trust in benevolent spiritual protection. This crisis of faith doesn't just affect their relationship with human authority, it fundamentally alters their ability to connect with divine safeguarding. Children subjected to physical violence often develop a form of spiritual hypervigilance. Their spirits become like wounded animals, simultaneously craving protection while instinctively distrusting any offered shelter. This paradox creates a perfect storm where malicious spiritual entities can present themselves as false protectors, exploiting this desperate need for safety. Beyond immediate pain, physical abuse creates spiritual echo chambers where violence reverberates through time. Each instance of abuse sends ripples through spiritual dimensions, attracting entities that resonate with pain, fear, and betrayal. These forces find easy access through wounds that never fully heal, using these trauma points as permanent anchors in their victims' lives. Most troubling is how this form of abuse can lead to spiritual Stockholm syndrome, where victims unknowingly align themselves with destructive spiritual forces, mistaking their oppressive presence for protection. Breaking free requires more than physical healing. It demands a complete restoration of spiritual boundaries and a relearning of what true protection feels like. Survival instincts developed during physical abuse often persist as spiritual defense mechanisms, creating barriers not just against human connections, but against genuine spiritual healing as well. These barriers, while originally protective, ultimately serve as isolation chambers where darker influences can maintain their hold unchallenged. Ritual and religious trauma inflicts a uniquely devastating wound on young souls. Within sacred spaces meant for divine connection, some children instead encounter spiritual poison disguised as medicine. When faith becomes weaponized against innocent hearts, it creates a spiritual paradox that attracts darker forces with frightening precision. Most damaging are rituals performed without love, mechanical acts of devotion driven by fear rather than faith. Children forced to participate in such empty ceremonies develop spiritual calluses, protective layers that inadvertently block divine light, while creating perfect conditions for shadows to gather. Each meaningless ritual becomes another brick in a wall between them and authentic spiritual connection. Religious abuse often comes wrapped in messages of unworthiness, shame, and eternal punishment. Young minds bombarded with images of divine wrath rather than divine love develop spiritual autoimmune responses. Their souls begin attacking genuine spiritual experiences, unable to distinguish nurturing truth from learned toxicity. This confusion creates spiritual backdoors through which malevolent entities can slip undetected. Particularly devastating is how religious trauma corrupts a child's spiritual discernment. When adults twist sacred teachings into tools of control, children lose their innate ability to recognize true spiritual light. This corruption of spiritual senses creates perfect hunting grounds for entities that thrive on religious fear and confusion. Within communities where rigid religious practices dominate, children often develop what could be called spiritual Stockholm syndrome. They bond deeply with belief systems that harm them, creating complex spiritual knots that malicious forces can easily manipulate. These knots become anchor points for darker influences, which often masquerade as familiar religious figures or concepts. Most insidious is how religious trauma creates spiritual double binds. Children learn to associate spiritual power with pain, divine presence with dread, and salvation with suffering. These false associations form spiritual trapdoors. When seeking escape from religious trauma, many inadvertently fall into deeper spiritual entanglements with forces that promise freedom but deliver further bondage. Beyond individual impact, religious trauma often spreads like spiritual contagion through generations. Each wounded soul becomes a potential transmitter of distorted faith, creating cycles of spiritual abuse that provide constant feeding grounds for malevolent entities seeking easy prey through corrupted religious channels. Witnessing dark acts during childhood burns permanent imprints into innocent souls. When young eyes observe rituals, practices, or behaviors that cross spiritual boundaries, these experiences become more than memories. They transform into spiritual homing beacons for malevolent forces. Each exposure acts like spiritual radiation, leaving invisible but lasting marks on developing spirits. Most concerning is how children absorb darkness without comprehending its significance. Whether through occult practices performed by family members, exposure to forbidden spiritual artifacts, or simply being present during acts of profound evil, young souls act like spiritual sponges. They don't just see these events, they unconsciously integrate them into their spiritual DNA. Dark acts witnessed in childhood create what might be called spiritual echo chambers. Inside these internal spaces, witnessed evil continues to reverberate long after exposure, creating harmonic frequencies that naturally attract similar spiritual energies. It's as though watching darkness leaves behind spiritual fingerprints that matching entities can easily detect and track. Particularly troubling are cases where children witness acts of spiritual significance without context or protection. A child who sees relatives practicing divination, conducting seances, or engaging with cursed objects becomes spiritually marked. These marks function like spiritual GPS coordinates, making it easier for malevolent forces to locate and influence them throughout life. Exposure to dark spiritual practices during childhood often leads to unconscious spiritual synchronization. Much like tuning forks that begin to vibrate at matching frequencies when placed near each other, witnessed darkness creates resonant frequencies in young souls that naturally align with similar spiritual energies. This alignment makes children more susceptible to spiritual interference, even years after initial exposure. Beyond immediate impact, witnessing dark acts creates what could be termed spiritual muscle memory. Just as bodies remember physical movements, souls remember spiritual exposures.
This spiritual conditioning makes individuals more likely to gravitate towards similar dark influences later in life, often without conscious awareness of why they feel drawn to certain spiritual practices or environments. Most devastating is how these witnessed acts create spiritual blind spots. Areas of darkness observed in childhood become normalized, making it harder for individuals to recognize spiritual danger signals in adulthood. These blind spots function as doorways through which malevolent entities can move freely, exploiting early exposure to maintain long-term influence. Extreme isolation during childhood creates spiritual dead zones, where malevolent forces thrive unchallenged. When young souls are cut off from normal human interaction, whether through neglect, intentional seclusion, or circumstantial isolation, they develop in spiritual vacuums that become perfect breeding grounds for darker influences. Social isolation doesn't just stunt emotional growth, it creates spiritual sensory deprivation. Much like plants growing in darkness become pale and twisted, souls developing in isolation become spiritually malformed. This malformation manifests as heightened vulnerability to entities that prey on lonely spirits, offering false communion to fill the void of human connection. Most critical is how isolation warps spiritual boundaries. Children need regular social interaction to develop healthy spiritual filters, ways of discerning beneficial influences from harmful ones. Without these interactions, they lack crucial spiritual immune responses, making them susceptible to any entity offering connection, regardless of its nature. Particularly dangerous is how extreme isolation creates spiritual hunger pangs. Souls starved of normal human bonds develop desperate cravings for connection. These cravings act like spiritual distress signals, broadcasting vulnerability across dimensional boundaries. Malevolent forces easily detect these signals, drawn to isolated souls like predators to wounded prey. Isolation during formative years often leads to spiritual synesthesia, where boundaries between physical and spiritual realms become blurred. Children in prolonged isolation may begin perceiving spiritual entities as more real than physical beings, creating dangerous precedents for future spiritual interactions. This blurring of realms makes it easier for darker forces to establish permanent footholds. Beyond immediate effects, childhood isolation creates spiritual echo chambers where darker influences can speak unchallenged. Without exposure to diverse human connections, isolated children lack comparative experiences to question or resist spiritual manipulation. Their isolation becomes a fortress where malevolent entities can operate freely, their influence unopposed by healthy human relationships. Most insidious is how isolation rewires spiritual seeking patterns. Souls developed in extreme isolation often maintain unconscious preferences for solitary spiritual experiences, unknowingly perpetuating cycles of vulnerability well into adulthood. These patterns become self-reinforcing spirals where isolation breeds more isolation, creating ever deeper spiritual vulnerabilities. Words spoken over children carry spiritual weight beyond their sound waves. Negative proclamations, harsh judgments, cruel predictions, or outright curses become spiritual seeds planted in fertile young souls. These verbal arrows pierce deeper than physical wounds, creating permanent spiritual anchors for malevolent forces to latch onto. Particularly devastating are curses disguised as discipline or correction. When authority figures repeatedly declare children worthless, stupid, or destined for failure, these pronunciations act like spiritual contracts, binding young souls to destructive prophecies. Each repetition of "you'll never amount to anything," or "you're just like your worthless father," carves spiritual grooves that darker forces easily follow. Most insidious is how verbal abuse creates self-fulfilling spiritual prophecies. Children internalize negative proclamations, unconsciously aligning their spiritual frequencies with these darker predictions. Statements like "you're pure evil" or "you'll end up in hell" become spiritual homing beacons, attracting exactly those forces that resonate with such declarations. Generational curses passed down through harsh words hold special power. When parents repeat toxic phrases they heard in their own childhood, they unknowingly strengthen ancient spiritual chains. These verbal chains create complex webs of negative energy, perfect conducting systems for malevolent influences to travel through family lines. Deeply troubling is how negative proclamations alter spiritual DNA. Much like radiation can mutate physical genes, harsh words spoken with authority can mutate spiritual genetic code. Children repeatedly told they're born bad or cursed develop spiritual mutations that make them more susceptible to darker influences throughout life. Beyond immediate impact, verbal curses create spiritual sound loops that continue playing long after words are spoken. Much like background radiation, these negative declarations continue influencing spiritual atmosphere years after their initial utterance. Each replay strengthens their power, creating ever deeper channels for malevolent forces to access. Most concerning is how verbal curses distort spiritual identity markers. When young souls are consistently mislabeled through negative proclamations, they lose touch with their true spiritual nature. This identity confusion creates perfect conditions for darker entities to suggest false identities aligned with original curses, perpetuating cycles of spiritual bondage through twisted self-fulfillment. Identity erosion in childhood creates spiritual vacancies where malevolent forces establish strongholds. When young souls lose connection with their authentic selves, through persistent negation, forced conformity, or systematic erasure of individuality, they become hollow vessels, prime territories for darker influences to colonize. Most devastating is how identity loss creates spiritual amnesia. Children disconnected from their true nature forget their divine birthright of strength and protection. This forgetting isn't just psychological, it's a spiritual unmooring that leaves souls drifting without internal compass, easily pulled into darker currents. Particularly dangerous are situations where children must suppress their authentic selves to survive. Forced to wear false faces, their spirits fragment into shadowy compartments. Each compartment becomes a potential entry point for entities that specialize in identity theft at the soul level. These entities offer counterfeit identities, promising belonging while delivering deeper alienation. Dissolution through childhood trauma creates what might be called spiritual static, interference patterns that scramble internal recognition systems. Children lose ability to distinguish their authentic spiritual signal from external noise. This confusion makes them susceptible to spiritual identity theft, where malevolent forces can insert false self-concepts into identity gaps. Beyond immediate impact, loss of identity creates spiritual nomads, souls wandering without secure sense of home or belonging. This rootlessness makes individuals vulnerable to spiritual colonization, where darker forces offer false shelter in exchange for sovereignty. Many accept these Faustian bargains unknowingly, trading authentic selfhood for counterfeit security. Most insidious is how identity loss corrupts spiritual DNA recognition. Just as immune systems need clear templates to identify foreign invaders, spirits need strong identity markers to reject harmful influences. When these markers become blurred or erased, souls lose ability to recognize and repel spiritual threats. This compromised spiritual immune system allows darker forces easy access. Profoundly troubling is how identity loss creates spiritual amnesia that spans generations. Children disconnected from authentic selfhood often become parents unable to mirror true identity back to their own offspring. This creates cascading patterns of identity erosion, where each generation becomes more susceptible to spiritual colonization than the last. Truth about childhood trauma and spiritual vulnerability might seem overwhelming, yet within this darkness lies profound hope for healing and restoration. Each doorway created through past wounds can be sealed, each spiritual vulnerability transformed into a point of strength. Breaking free from these influences requires more than mere awareness, it demands active reclamation of spiritual sovereignty. Starting today, protection begins with recognition. By identifying these 7 childhood traumas, emotional abandonment, physical abuse, religious trauma, witness to darkness, extreme isolation, verbal curses and identity loss, we gain power over their influence. These wounds may have created openings, but they don't have to remain permanent access points for malevolent forces. Healing these spiritual vulnerabilities follows natural laws, much like physical healing. Just as broken bones often grow back stronger at points of fracture, spiritual wounds can become sources of unprecedented power when properly addressed. Each trauma point holds potential for transformation, each vulnerability an opportunity for establishing stronger spiritual boundaries. Breaking generational cycles requires courage to face these darker truths. Many carry these wounds without realizing their spiritual impact, passing invisible vulnerabilities to next generations. By bringing these hidden dynamics into light, we interrupt patterns that have persisted for centuries. This awareness alone begins closing doors that darker forces have long exploited. Most crucial is understanding that spiritual sovereignty can be reclaimed at any point. Age of trauma doesn't determine destiny. Whether wounds occurred decades ago or are still fresh, possibilities for healing remain constant. Spiritual protection systems can be rebuilt, stronger and more resilient than original barriers that were breached. These childhood traumas may have created spiritual frequencies that attracted unwanted attention, but frequencies can be changed. Through conscious awareness, spiritual cleansing, and establishment of healthy boundaries, souls can be retuned to resonate with light rather than darkness. This retuning process may take time, but each step toward wholeness weakens malevolent influences' ability to maintain their hold. Moreover, healing these spiritual vulnerabilities often triggers chain reactions of restoration. As individuals reclaim their spiritual sovereignty, they naturally begin radiating frequencies that help others break free from similar bondage. This creates ripple effects of healing that extend far beyond individual restoration, potentially transforming entire family lines. Protection against spiritual interference becomes stronger when communities unite in awareness. By sharing this knowledge, we create networks of support where healing can flourish. Each person who breaks free from these childhood trauma-induced vulnerabilities becomes a lighthouse, helping others navigate away from dangerous spiritual territories. Moving forward requires both vigilance and hope. While childhood traumas may have created these vulnerabilities, adult awareness and action can seal these breaches permanently. Every step taken toward healing is a victory not just for individuals, but for all those connected to them through bonds of blood or spirit. These spiritual vulnerabilities may have shaped past experiences, but they don't have to determine future trajectory. Power to close these spiritual doorways lies within reach, waiting to be claimed through conscious choice and consistent action. For deeper understanding of these crucial insights and continued guidance on spiritual protection, make sure to support our channel. Every like helps spread this vital knowledge to others who might be struggling with similar spiritual vulnerabilities. Hit subscribe button to join our community of spiritual warriors committed to breaking free from childhood trauma's darker implications. Remember, liking and subscribing isn't just about supporting content creation, it's about helping build a network of awareness where healing can flourish. By engaging with this channel, you become part of a movement breaking chains of spiritual vulnerability, one soul at a time. Together, we can create ripples of transformation that reach far beyond our individual journeys. This isn't just about personal healing, it's about collective liberation from patterns that have bound generations. Share this video with those who might need these insights, and stay tuned for more deep dives into spiritual warfare and protection strategies. Knowledge shared is power multiplied, and every view, like, and subscription helps expand this circle of awareness. Together, we're building something powerful, a community dedicated to understanding and overcoming spiritual vulnerabilities. Don't miss future episodes exploring these crucial topics in greater depth. Hit that subscribe button now, and join us on this journey of spiritual reclamation and healing.